We're excited to be celebrating 25 years of coeducation at Lawrenceville this year. It's hard to believe that it's only been 25 years since the first girls came to Lawrenceville. The decision to go co-ed was a long, drawn-out one that required both champions and pioneers. The major champion was Bruce McClellan, one of my predecessors, who worked with the board over the course of 20 years and nearly 12 studies to determine that Lawrenceville should become co-ed. His perseverance was finally rewarded with the decision to go co-ed in 1985. Strikingly, his two granddaughters graduated from Lawrenceville in 2010, the year of our bicentennial. Another champion of coeducation was Graham Cole, who was then the Dean of Faculty. He is featured on this video. Also featured on this video are two of the early pioneers of coeducation. Rué Mount Hanawald, who was one of the first students to attend Lawrenceville, and Chris Schulte, who was an early teacher here and also was one of the first housemasters in a Crescent house. Both of them teach at the school today and play leading roles here. One of the fears of going co-ed was that Laurentians would not be as loyal if we were co-ed as if we were single-sex. The commitment of the three people featured on this film speak to the enduring loyalty of Laurentians.
25 years ago, the culture of Lawrenceville was changed forever as girls were admitted as students for the first time. For many years, coeducation had been brought up for discussion, but it was not until 1985 that the final decision was made, with 95% of the faculty in support. Even though the decision had been made in favor of coeducation, girls were not to move onto campus until 2 years later. During those 2 years, the Lawrenceville faculty trained and prepared the campus for the arrival of girls, including the review of residential life, athletics and curriculum, campus security, medical counseling, the building of the Crescent houses, the addition of girls' bathrooms in buildings, the redistribution of coaches, a changing of the infirm system, the school rules, and many others. Another change came in the faculty. More women were added and placed in higher leadership positions. In 1987, the first girls finally moved onto campus. Coeducation in the long run proved to be one of the best decisions the school has made in its history. However, the road to coeducation has not been a smooth one.
There had been a lot of opposition to coeducation in probably the 10 years leading up to that 1985 spring board meeting when it was finally approved. Matter of fact, at one point, the board had voted that they had talked about coeducation long enough and they put a moratorium on further discussion of coeducation, which I think was to last like 5 years. But when the final vote was taken in 1985, it wasn't unanimous at the board level, but it passed with a huge majority and great enthusiasm in almost every quarter.
1986-87 was the first school year, and students came in every grade, and I was in the second form that year in Stanley House.
They were sort of preparing us for coeducation, the idea that when the girls' Crescent houses were built, that I would be housemaster of those. And so the next year, I was the housemaster of Stephen's house.
In the first year, they only had the Crescent. They didn't have McPherson or Reynolds for girls. They had just built the 4 girls' houses, and in fact, of course, Carter wasn't here. It was still the infirm. So the way it worked was McClellan House was for seniors. Stanley and Stevens was for the Crescent, like the sophomore, junior, the 3rd and 4th form. And then at the time, it was called Alumni House. It wasn't called Kirby House. Alumni House was the freshman housing.
In the main, I think most people felt very, very enthusiastic about this decision. In fact, most of us are saying, what took us so long to get there? We talked to teachers about what should we be doing in our classrooms. We talked about the arts programs, what should we be thinking about. We looked very carefully at dorms, residential spaces, parietal rules. All these things were new to us. But we went to school on all these other schools' experiences, and it really was a wonderful educational experience for all of us who had only been in all-male schools before.
Because the numbers were as they were, you'd have a lot of classes where there would be 1 or 2 girls with a whole class of boys. And so depending on the girls, it would vary whether or not they would speak up. So if they were really, really confident, they would speak up and it was no problem. But it was an odd dynamic with that. And sometimes you'd have classes with all boys, with no girls at all in them. Even so, here we're co-ed, and it didn't really seem to be changed.
I think overall they were excited. I think that there had been some communication about the school was going co-ed that had been really well planned for a bunch of years. So by the time it actually happened, most everybody was anticipating it and ready for it. But I think also, like the boys in particular, they weren't used to it. So they just didn't quite know how to handle it. So for example, a classroom that has 11 boys and 3 girls, like, could be at times an awkward, situation.
I think for the vast majority of the teachers, it was great. They loved it. They loved to have the different sort of dynamic in the classes. I think that they treated the kids perfectly fairly. I think some of the really old school faculty still had a hard time that this was not the old school, because there were changes that the girls brought. There were changes in the dining hall. The boys were all angry at how we changed the meals. So I think some of the faculty had some difficulty with that, but I think individually they loved many of their female students, and I think the vast majority of the faculty loved it, thought that made the school a better place, a better school, academically, richer, happier. It was definitely a happier place, and I think the faculty recognized that and really embraced it and were excited.
When I was a student here, I was track captain of field hockey, swimming, and rowing, and probably it was the field hockey team that had greatest success. They were, I think, state champs in the first year and Mercer County champs and things like that. And so things, I think, went well right from the very beginning. It was also pretty fun being in the beginning because every uniform was new and all the fields were kind of newly equipped for the girls' games. And so that was pretty nice to be on such a well-planned, on the receiving end of such a well-planned, well-supported kind of endeavor as far as athletics go.
So we didn't have invited friends. Those didn't exist. We didn't do things after check-in. So the social life really consisted of kind of hanging out together and dances. There really weren't a lot of kind of different sorts of activities that were done. So girls and boys were in clubs together and that kind of thing, but there wasn't the variety of social options that there are now.
I'd say the biggest difference is there's a lot more female faculty, and there's a lot more female faculty in positions of leadership. And I would say also we do have more girls in positions of leadership around the school. I remember the senior prank my first year at school was they had gotten the mailing list for all the parents of all the girls, and they sent home a letter. I guess it wasn't so much the email. So they sent home a letter saying that they tried education, it didn't work, and so you'd have to find like a new school for your daughter the next year. And I remember my dad got that letter and he was so fired up. He was calling the schools, like really irate about the whole situation. So it definitely worked. It had like the school stationery and everything, so he completely fell for it. It's funny.
When the girls came, I noticed an immediate shift in just the lightness of the place. People were they smiled more. The boys and the girls were, it's fun, so it was just a happier place. They still worked hard, they still played hard, at their athletics or their extracurriculars, but they just got more joy out of kind of every day.
One particular faculty member, Ken Kerfel, a name that will be known to particularly the men, the alumni out there. He was the varsity football coach and he was a sweet man, in addition to being a very good coach. And I think Ken was opposed to coeducation in part because he was afraid that with reduced numbers of boys, his football team wouldn't be as good. But I think more fairly for Ken, that again, it was changing the school in a way that it would just be unfamiliar to him. And I've never forgotten this, that Ken Kerfel walked into my office halfway through the fall term. And this was a senior faculty member, hugely respected, a really beloved fellow. And he walked in, he came into my office, and he came over and shook my hand because he knew I was very, very staunchly in favor of coeducation. And he came in and he said, "Graham," he said, "I want to apologize to you." I said, "Ken, why?" He said, "I was wrong. Coeducation is fantastic."
One of the major reasons that the trustees eventually voted to become co-ed is they wanted to make sure that Lawrenceville remained a preeminent institution because they recognized that both men and women were playing leading roles in all fields and professions. Many of us who are at Lawrenceville today, including me, would not be here had the trustees not decided to go co-ed. I'm enormously grateful for that decision and pleased to be able to serve this fine school.